Welcome to Cozy Jury. Tonight's story will test you. It's messy, it's complicated, and by the end, you will decide who's right and who's wrong. But before we begin, if you value what we're building here, hit like. Subscribe if you want more of this, but only if this is your kind of content. I'd rather earn it than beg for it. Drop a comment. Where are you right now and what time is it? I love knowing who's out there deliberating with us. Now get comfortable. You're not just listening, you're the jury. The fire's burning. The case is open. Let's begin. Julian Herrera woke up at 6:15 on Christmas morning to an empty house. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that feels wrong, like walking into a room where a conversation just stopped. He sat up in bed, listening. No footsteps on the hardwood floors. No coffee brewing downstairs. No laughter from the guest rooms where his daughter Valeria, her husband Matteo, and Matteo's parents Arturo and Elena should have been stirring awake, excited about the luxury mountain vacation he'd spent $17,000 planning for them. Instead, there was nothing. Just the hum of the heating system and the distant sound of a neighbor's dog barking 3 houses down. He got out of bed, pulled on his robe, and walked down the hallway. The guest room doors were open. The beds were made, not just made, stripped. The decorative pillows he'd carefully arranged were gone. The luggage that had been stacked against the wall the night before was gone. He stood in the doorway of what should have been Valeria and Matteo's room, his hand on the doorframe, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His mind went to the logical places first. Maybe they went out for breakfast. Maybe they wanted to surprise him with something. Maybe there was a last-minute errand before the trip. But then he saw the note. It was on the kitchen counter, propped against the coffee maker he'd set up the night before so it would be ready when everyone woke up. White printer paper folded once. His name written on the outside in Valeria's handwriting. He picked it up. His hands were steady. He wasn't panicking yet. He still thought there was a reasonable explanation. The note said, "Dad, we decided to head up to the resort early. Didn't want to wake you? We'll see you when you get there. Merry Christmas. Love, Val." He read it twice. Then a third time. The words didn't change. "We decided to head up to the resort early. Didn't want to wake you. We'll see you when you get there." He looked at the clock on the microwave. 6:22. He looked back at the note. Something about it felt off. The phrasing, the timing, the fact that they'd taken all their things, stripped the beds, and left without saying goodbye, without waking him. On Christmas morning, he pulled out his phone and called Valeria. It went straight to voicemail. He tried Matteo, same thing. He stood there in his kitchen, holding the note in one hand and his phone in the other, and that's when the first real crack of doubt appeared. The thought that wouldn't quite form but was pushing at the edges of his consciousness. The thought that said, this wasn't spontaneous, this was planned. He walked into the living room. The Christmas tree was still lit, the presents he'd wrapped for everyone still underneath. He'd spent hours picking out gifts. Cashmere scarves for Eleanor. A leather wallet for Arturo. Noise-cancelling headphones for Matteo, because he'd mentioned once, offhand, that he wanted a pair. And for Valeria, a vintage watch that had belonged to her grandmother, his late wife, that he'd had restored. All of it still sitting there, untouched. His phone buzzed. A text from Valeria. "Just seeing this. We're already on the road. Service is spotty. Talk when we get there." He stared at the message. Already on the road. It was 6:30 in the morning. They would have had to leave at 5, maybe earlier, to be far enough out that service was spotty, which meant they hadn't just decided to leave early. They'd planned this. They'd woken up in his house, in the beds he'd prepared for them, gathered their things in silence, and left, without him. He sat down on the couch. The coffee maker beeped in the kitchen, the pot full and ready for a family breakfast that wasn't going to happen. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears, not racing, not yet, but present. Heavy. The kind of heartbeat you notice when you're trying to stay calm but your body knows something's wrong. He thought back to the night before. Christmas Eve. They'd all been there. Dinner had been fine. Normal. Valeria and Matteo had seemed a little distracted maybe, but he'd chalked that up to excitement about the trip. Arturo and Elena had been gracious, as always, thanking him repeatedly for his generosity, for organizing everything, for including them. They'd opened one present each, a tradition from when Valeria was little. They'd laughed, they'd hugged, and then, around 10, everyone had said good night and gone to their rooms. And at some point after that, they'd decided to leave, together, without him. He tried calling again. Valeria's phone rang this time, but she didn't pick up. He called Matteo, no answer. Arturo, Elena, nothing. He was about to try Valeria again when his phone buzzed with another text. This one from Matteo. Sorry for the confusion. We thought you'd want to sleep in. We'll explain when we see you. Julian read the message 3 times. Sorry for the confusion. As if this was a mix-up, a miscommunication, as if 5 people packing their bags and leaving his house before dawn on Christmas morning was some kind of innocent mistake. He set the phone down on the coffee table. His hands were shaking now. Not a lot. Just a tremor. The kind you get when adrenaline starts to move through your system, and you're not sure yet if it's going to turn into anger or panic or something else entirely. He stood up. He walked back into the kitchen. The note was still on the counter. He picked it up again, read it again, and this time he noticed what wasn't there. No apology. No acknowledgement that leaving without him might be hurtful. No explanation beyond didn't want to wake you, which was ridiculous because they could have woken him. They could have knocked on his door and said, "Hey, we're heading out early, want to come?" But they hadn't. They'd chosen to leave him behind. He thought about the trip, the $17,000 he'd spent, the 5-star resort he'd booked for a week, the private chef he'd arranged for Christmas dinner, the ski passes, the spa appointments, the wine tasting he'd scheduled because Arturo mentioned once that he appreciated a good Cabernet. Every detail planned, every expense covered, all of it a gift, all of it because he wanted to do something special for his family, because he wanted to create memories, because he loved them, and they'd left him. He poured himself a cup of coffee. His hands were steadier now. The adrenaline was settling into something colder, something harder. He sat back down on the couch and looked at the Christmas tree. The lights were blinking in a pattern he'd programmed himself. Red, green, gold, red, green, gold, festive, cheerful, completely at odds with the hollow feeling spreading through his chest. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe they really did think he'd want to sleep in. Maybe they didn't realize how it would look. Maybe there was some explanation he wasn't seeing yet. But the more he sat there, the more he replayed the night before, the more he realized there were signs. Small things. Valeria had been distant during dinner, checking her phone more than usual. Matteo had steered the conversation away every time Julian brought up the trip itinerary. Elena had asked, casually, if Julian had finalized all the reservations, and when he said yes, she'd exchanged a look with Arturo. A quick look, the kind you don't think about at the time, but that sticks in your memory later. They'd all known they were leaving without him. He picked up his phone again. He pulled up the group text thread he'd created for the trip. The last message was from him, sent 2 days ago, confirming the departure time. Noon on Christmas Day. He'd suggested noon specifically so they could have a relaxed morning, open presents, have breakfast together. No one had objected. No one had suggested leaving earlier. They'd just agreed. And then they'd left at 5 in the morning without telling him. He set the phone down. He stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at his front yard. The lawn was dusted with frost. The street was empty. Across the way he could see lights on in the Miller house, their family probably gathered around their tree, doing what families do on Christmas morning. He thought about calling someone, a friend, his brother, someone who could tell him he was overreacting, that this was all some misunderstanding, but he didn't, because deep down he knew this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was a choice. They had chosen to exclude him from a trip he had paid for, a trip he had planned, a trip that was supposed to be about family. He thought about the money, $17,000. It wasn't about the money, not really, but it was hard not to think about it. The resort alone was $8,000 for the week. The private chef was $3,000. The ski passes, the spa, the wine tasting, the upgraded rooms, all of it adding up. He'd put it on his credit card without hesitation because he wanted them to have the best. He wanted Valeria to feel spoiled. He wanted Arturo and Elena to feel welcomed. He wanted Matteo to see that being part of this family meant being cared for. And this is what he got in return. He looked at the clock, 6:50. They were probably an hour into their drive by now, maybe more, laughing, excited, talking about the week ahead. Maybe they'd already forgotten about him. Maybe they hadn't thought about him at all. Now you might think you know exactly what happened here. A thoughtless family, a hurt father. But it's not that simple, because this note, this empty house, this silent Christmas morning, wasn't the end. It was the trigger for a war. And what Julian didn't know yet, standing there in his living room with cold coffee and a sinking feeling in his gut, was that by the time this story was over, he would make a decision that half the people hearing it would call justice, and the other half would call revenge. He would take an action so decisive, so controversial, that it would fracture his family in ways none of them saw coming.
And the question you'll have to answer is whether he was right to do it. But to render a fair verdict, you can't just look at the crime. You have to understand the motive. And the motive started years ago. It started with a man who loved his family more than anything, and a daughter who maybe loved his money just a little bit more than she loved him back. Let's go back to the beginning.
To the very first red flag that everyone missed. Julian Herrera met his late wife, Caroline, in Chicago 35 years ago at a fundraiser for the Art Institute. He was 27, working in commercial real estate, trying to make a name for himself in a city that didn't care about ambition unless you backed it up with results. She was 24, a graphic designer with a laugh that could fill a room and a way of looking at the world that made everything seem more interesting. They talked for 3 hours that night, standing in a corner near a Monet exhibit, ignoring the speeches and the canapes and everyone else. By the time the event ended, he'd gotten her number. By the end of the month, they were inseparable. Their relationship was built on a kind of easy partnership that people spend their whole lives looking for. Caroline was creative and spontaneous. Julian was methodical and ambitious. She balanced him out. He gave her stability. They got married 2 years later in a small ceremony in Lincoln Park, just family and close friends, nothing extravagant. Caroline had insisted on that. She didn't care about spectacle, she cared about meaning, and their marriage had meaning, real, deep, lasting meaning. They had Valeria 3 years into the marriage. Julian was 32 by then, doing well in real estate, starting to build the portfolio that would eventually make him wealthy. Caroline was freelancing from home, designing logos and branding packages for small businesses. taking care of their daughter, managing the life they were building together. Valeria was a happy kid, bright, curious, a little stubborn, which Caroline said she got from Julian, and Julian said she got from Caroline. The truth was, she got it from both of them. Julian's business took off when Valeria was in elementary school. He'd started buying distressed properties, renovating them, flipping them for profit. It was risky, but he had a good eye for potential and a work ethic that didn't quit. By the time Valeria was 10, they'd moved from their modest townhouse in Wicker Park to a larger home in Lincoln Square. By the time she was 15, Julian had transitioned from flipping properties to developing them. Office buildings, mixed-use complexes, the kind of projects that required serious capital and serious connections. He had both. Caroline didn't care about the money. She cared that Julian was happy, that he was building something, that he was providing for their family. She kept their life grounded. She made sure Valeria understood the value of hard work, that wealth was a privilege, not an entitlement. She was the one who insisted Valeria get a part-time job in high school, even though they didn't need the income. She was the one who made sure their daughter understood that money came with responsibility. Julian adored Caroline for that. He adored everything about her. The way she could turn a dinner party into an event without trying. The way she remembered details about people's lives and checked in on them. The way she never let success go to his head. She was his anchor, his conscience, his best friend. They had routines. Sunday mornings were for the farmer's market. Friday nights were date nights, no matter how busy Julian's week had been. They'd try a new restaurant or revisit an old favorite, and they'd talk about everything. Valeria's school, Julian's projects, Caroline's design work, their plans for the future. They talked about retiring early, maybe buying a place in Colorado where they could ski in the winter and hike in the summer. They talked about traveling, about spending more time together once Valeria was grown and out of the house. But then, when Valeria was 23 and finishing grad school, Caroline got sick. It started with fatigue, then weight loss, then tests, then more tests. By the time they got the diagnosis, stage 3 pancreatic cancer, it was already too late. The doctors gave her a year. She made it 8 months. Julian was 52 when she died. Valeria was 24. The grief was total. For Julian, it was like losing half of himself. For Valeria, it was losing the person who had always been her compass. They leaned on each other in those first months. Julian threw himself into work because sitting still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant breaking down. Valeria moved back home for a while, partly to keep him company, partly because she couldn't stand being alone in her apartment. But even in the grief, there were differences. Julian mourned by preserving. He kept Caroline's office exactly as she'd left it. Her coffee mug on the desk, her sketches pinned to the wall, her favorite cardigan draped over the chair. Valeria mourned by moving forward. She started dating someone new 6 months after her mother's death. She took a job in marketing. She started talking about moving to a bigger city, maybe New York or Los Angeles, somewhere that felt like a fresh start. Julian didn't begrudge her that. He wanted her to be happy. He wanted her to live her life. But he also wanted to hold on to the family they'd been. So he started doing things, big things, generous things. He paid off Valeria's student loans without her asking. He bought her a car when her old one broke down. He offered to help with a down payment on a condo when she mentioned wanting to buy. He wasn't trying to buy her love. He was trying to fill the void Caroline had left. He was trying to be both parents. He was trying to prove that even though their family was smaller now, it was still a family. Valeria appreciated it. At least, she said she did. She'd thank him, hug him, tell him he didn't have to do all that. But she also didn't refuse. And over time it became expected. Birthdays came with generous checks. Holidays came with expensive gifts. When Valeria mentioned wanting to take a trip to Europe, Julian offered to pay for it. When she complained about her apartment, Julian helped her move to a nicer one and covered the first 3 months of rent. Looking back, Julian could see the pattern forming, but at the time, it felt good. It felt like love. It felt like the kind of support Caroline would have wanted him to give their daughter. It felt like he was doing something right. Then 3 years after Caroline's death, Valeria met Matteo. He was a sales manager at a tech startup. Handsome, charming, good at making small talk. Valeria was smitten. They dated for a year before getting engaged. Julian liked Matteo well enough. He seemed stable. He treated Valeria well, or at least well enough. There were small things that bothered Julian. Matteo's tendency to let Valeria pick up the check when they went out, even though Julian knew his daughter made less money. The way Matteo always seemed to know exactly what to say to get what he wanted. But Julian told himself he was being overprotective, that no one would ever be good enough for his daughter, that he needed to let her make her own choices. When they got engaged, Julian offered to pay for the wedding. Not just contribute, pay for the whole thing. Venue, catering, flowers, band, everything. It was what Caroline would have wanted, he told himself. She would have wanted Valeria to have a beautiful wedding. She would have wanted their daughter to start her marriage without financial stress. The wedding cost $42,000. Julian didn't blink. He wrote the checks. He smiled through the whole event. He walked Valeria down the aisle and gave a toast that made people cry. He meant every word of it. He told Valeria he was proud of her, that he loved her, that he knew her mother would have loved Matteo too. After the wedding, things shifted. Valeria and Matteo bought a house. Julian helped with the down payment. They needed new furniture. Julian took them shopping. Matteo's car broke down. Julian co-signed a loan for a new one. It was always something, and Julian always said yes, because saying yes felt like love. Saying yes felt like he was still part of Valeria's life. But there were moments, small moments, like when Valeria called to say she couldn't make it to their usual Sunday brunch because she and Matteo were busy, and Julian would hang up the phone feeling a little hollow. Or when he'd suggest they all go to dinner and Valeria would say they already had plans. Or when Julian would drop by their house unannounced and catch a look between Valeria and Matteo. A look that said, "Oh, it's him again." He told himself he was imagining it, that he was being sensitive, that Valeria was just building her own life, which was healthy and normal and what parents were supposed to want. But then there were the bigger things, like when Matteo's parents, Arturo and Elena, came to visit from Arizona. Julian invited all of them over for dinner. He made a big deal out of it, cooked a full meal, bought wine, set the table with Caroline's good china. Arturo and Elena were polite, gracious. They thanked him for his hospitality. They told stories about Matteo's childhood. They laughed at Julian's jokes. It was a nice evening. But at the end of the night, as they were leaving, Julian overheard Matteo say something to Valeria. They were standing by the front door, putting on their coats, and Julian was in the kitchen cleaning up. Matteo's voice was low, but Julian heard it. He said, "Your dad's a lot." Valeria laughed. A small laugh. Not mean, but not defensive either. Just agreeing. Julian stood at the sink, holding a wet plate, and felt something crack inside him. Not break, just crack. The first hairline fracture, in the foundation of what he thought his relationship with his daughter was. He didn't say anything. He didn't confront her. He told himself Matteo was just tired, that it didn't mean anything, that he was being oversensitive. But the crack was there, and over the next year it got wider. Valeria started calling less. Their Sunday brunches became bi-weekly, then monthly. When Julian asked about her life, her answers got shorter. When he offered to help with things, she'd sometimes say no, which was new. She'd say they were fine, that they didn't need anything, that they were handling it. Julian told himself this was good, that Valeria was becoming independent, that he'd raised her to be self-sufficient. But it didn't feel good. It felt like he was being edged out. And then, 6 months before Christmas, Valeria called and asked if Julian would be willing to do something for them. She and Matteo wanted to take a big family trip. Somewhere nice? Somewhere they could all spend time together and relax. Arturo and Elena were getting older. This might be one of the last chances to do something like this as a family. She didn't explicitly ask Julian to pay for it, but the implication was clear. Julian, as always, said yes. He'd plan it. He'd handle everything. It would be his gift to them, to everyone. A chance to build new memories, a chance to be close again. Valeria thanked him. She sounded genuinely grateful. She said, "You're the best, Dad. I love you." And Julian believed her. He spent months planning that trip. He researched resorts. He read reviews. He called ahead to arrange special touches, the private chef, the wine tasting, the upgraded rooms. He wanted it to be perfect. He wanted everyone to have the time of their lives. He wanted Valeria to see how much he cared, how much he loved her, how much family mattered to him. And on Christmas Eve, sitting around his dining table, listening to Arturo tell a story about Matteo's first job, watching Valeria laugh, feeling the warmth of having everyone together, Julian thought he'd done it. He thought he'd created the kind of Christmas Caroline would have loved, the kind of family moment that would remind everyone why they mattered to each other. He had no idea that in less than 12 hours they'd all be gone. He had no idea that the trip he'd planned, the vacation he'd spent $17,000 on, the week he'd organized down to the smallest detail, was never meant to include him. And when he woke up that Christmas morning to an empty house and a cold note on the counter, he realized something that had been true for a long time, but that he'd refused to see. He wasn't part of their family anymore. He was their bank account, their convenient benefactor, the guy who paid for things. Everything seemed fine, normal, until it wasn't. Julian stood in his kitchen on Christmas morning, holding that note, and felt the foundation give way completely. But he didn't cry, he didn't collapse. He got very, very calm. And in that calm, he started to think. He started to calculate. He started to plan. Because if they were going to treat him like an ATM, then maybe it was time to shut down the machine. And what happened next would change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about what happened in those first few hours. Let's talk about the moment Julian decided that being generous was over and being strategic had to begin. Julian sat on his couch for 20 minutes after reading that note, just staring at his phone. Part of him kept expecting a follow-up text, an apology, an explanation that made sense. But nothing came. He refreshed his messages. He checked his email in case Valeria had sent something there. Nothing. Radio silence except for those 2 brief, dismissive texts, already on the road. Talk when we get there. At 7:15 he stood up. He walked into his study and opened the filing cabinet where he kept all the trip documentation. He'd printed everything out, confirmations, itineraries, receipts. He was old school about that kind of thing. He liked having physical copies. He pulled out the folder and sat down at his desk. The resort confirmation was on top. Mountain Peak Lodge, Aspen, Colorado. 5 nights, 6 days, 3 suites. He'd booked the premium level, which meant private balconies, fireplaces, fully stocked kitchens, and access to the concierge service. Check-in was at 3 p.m. on December 25th. The total for the rooms alone was $8,200. Underneath that was the private chef confirmation. Chef Marcus Delacroix, a Michelin-trained chef who specialized in alpine cuisine and holiday menus. He'd agreed to prepare Christmas dinner for the group: roasted duck with cherry reduction, truffle mashed potatoes, seasonal vegetables sourced from local farms, a 5-course meal with wine pairings, $3,000, the ski passes, 5 full-access passes to Aspen Mountain, good for the week, $1,200, the spa package, couples massages for Valeria and Matteo, individual treatments for Arturo and Elena, $800, the wine tasting, a private session at a boutique vineyard 30 minutes from the resort, arranged specifically because Arturo had mentioned his appreciation for good wine, tasting of 6 vintages with cheese pairings and a tour of the cellars, $500, transportation, a luxury SUV rental to accommodate everyone comfortably, 7 days, $900, and the extras, the little things he'd added to make it special: champagne and chocolate-covered strawberries delivered to each suite on arrival, fresh flowers, a custom gift basket for each person with local artisan goods, another $600. He did the math in his head, $17,200, not counting what he'd spent on Christmas gifts, not counting the dinner he'd hosted on Christmas Eve, not counting the wine he'd bought, the groceries, the effort, the time. $17,000 for a trip they'd decided he didn't need to be part of. He picked up his phone and opened his banking app. He pulled up his credit card statement. The charges were all there, processed and posted, paid for, done. He sat back in his chair. The house was so quiet he could hear the clock ticking on the wall. A gift from Caroline. She'd found it at an antique shop in Evanston. He remembered the day she brought it home, how excited she'd been about the craftsmanship. He remembered her saying, "This is the kind of thing that lasts." He looked at the folder of documents. He thought about Valeria and Matteo, probably pulling into a rest stop somewhere in Iowa, grabbing coffee, laughing about something. He thought about Arturo and Elena in the back seat, grateful to be included, oblivious to the fact that their presence was being used as a weapon against Julian. Because that's what this was, he realized. Bringing Matteo's parents wasn't about generosity. It was about dilution. It was about making sure Julian wasn't the center of attention. It was about reducing his role to that of a provider. And that realization did something to him. It turned the hurt into something colder, something sharper. He picked up his phone and called the resort. A cheerful voice answered. "Mountain Peak Lodge, this is Stephanie. How can I help you?" Julian kept his voice even, professional. "Hi, Stephanie. I have a reservation under the name Julian Herrera. Check-in is today at 3 p.m. I need to cancel it." There was a pause. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Can I ask if there's a problem with the reservation?" "No problem," Julian said. "Change of plans. I'd like to cancel all 3 suites." "Okay?" He could hear her typing. "Just to confirm, that's suites 12, 14, and 16 premium level. Checking in today for 5 nights." "That's correct." "I see. And you're aware that our cancellation policy for peak season bookings requires 72 hours notice for a full refund? Since we're within that window, I can only offer a 50% refund." "I understand," Julian said. "Cancel it anyway." More typing. "All right, I processed the cancellation. You'll see a credit of $4,100 to the card on file within 5 to 7 business days. Is there anything else I can help you with?" "Actually, yes. I also arranged a private chef service through your concierge, Chef Marcus Delacroix. I need to cancel that as well." "Let me transfer you to concierge. Hold music. Classical. Something by Vivaldi." Julian waited. A minute later, a different voice. Concierge, this is Brandon. Julian repeated the request. Brandon sounded confused. You'd like to cancel the chef service? That's scheduled for this evening. Chef Delacroix is likely already preparing. I'm aware, Julian said. Cancel it anyway. Sir, the cancellation policy for personal chef services is 48 hours. If we cancel now, you'll forfeit the full deposit. That's fine. That's $1,500. I understand. Cancel it. Brandon hesitated. Okay, if you're sure. I'll notify Chef Delacroix, but I do need to inform you that he may not be pleased. He turned down other bookings for tonight. That's not my problem anymore, Julian said. Cancel it. All right, cancellation is processed. Julian hung up. He looked at his list. Next was the ski passes. He called the resort ski concierge. Same script. Cancel the passes. Yes, he understood there was a cancellation fee. Yes, he was sure. Done. The spa, cancel. The wine tasting, cancel. The car rental, cancel. By the time he was done, it was 8 a.m. He'd spent 45 minutes dismantling every detail of the trip he'd spent months planning. Some of the cancellations had cost him money, some hadn't. He didn't care. What mattered was that when Valeria, Matteo, Arturo, and Elena arrived at that resort in 7 hours, there would be nothing waiting for them. No rooms, no chef, no activities, nothing. He leaned back in his chair and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Control. Not the kind of control that comes from money or generosity or being needed. The kind of control that comes from saying no, from setting a boundary, from deciding that his worth was not measured by what he could provide. His phone buzzed. A text from Valeria. Hey Dad, just wanted to say Merry Christmas again. We'll call you when we get settled at the resort. Love you. Julian stared at the message. The casual tone, the assumption that everything was fine, the assumption that he'd just sit at home, alone on Christmas, and wait for their call, wait for them to include him on their terms. He didn't respond. Instead, he opened a new contact in his phone, Ricardo Mendez, his attorney. They'd worked together for years on business deals, contracts, real estate transactions. Ricardo was smart, discreet. The kind of lawyer who didn't ask unnecessary questions, but knew how to handle delicate situations. Julian sent a text. Ricardo, I need to talk to you about a personal matter. Can you call me when you have a chance? It's somewhat urgent. The response came 2 minutes later. Give me 10 minutes. Julian stood up. He walked to the kitchen and poured himself another cup of coffee. The house felt different now. Not empty, not sad, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before something big happens. His phone rang. Ricardo. Julian, Merry Christmas. What's going on? Julian explained. Not the emotions, just the facts, the trip, the note, the cancellations, and then the reason he was calling. Over the past few years, I've given Valeria and Matteo significant financial support. Some of it was gifts, but some of it was structured as loans. Informal loans, but loans nonetheless. I have documentation, emails where I specified that certain amounts were to be repaid when they were financially stable. I want to know if I can enforce those repayments. Ricardo was quiet for a moment. How much are we talking about? Julian pulled up the records on his computer. He'd always been meticulous about finances. $63,000, that's not counting gifts like the wedding, or the down payment on their house, which I classified as gifts. But there are 3 specific instances where I loaned the money with the understanding that it would be repaid. Car loan cosign that I ended up covering when Matteo defaulted. $22,000. A business investment Matteo asked me to make in a startup that never returned the capital, $25,000. And a personal loan to Valeria for graduate school expenses that we agreed she'd repay once she was settled in her career, $16,000. And you have documentation of these being loans,
Not gifts. Emails, text messages. In 2 cases, promissory notes that they signed. Then yes, Ricardo said. Legally, you can pursue repayment. But Julian, I have to ask, is this really what you want to do? This is your daughter. Julian looked out the window at his frost-covered lawn. They left me behind on a trip I paid for, Ricardo. They planned it. They knew what they were doing.
And I'm done being the person they turn to only when they need something. Ricardo sighed. All right. If you want to move forward, I can draft a formal demand letter. Give them 30 days to respond with a repayment plan. If they don't respond or refuse, we can pursue legal action. Do it, Julian said. Okay, I'll have it ready by tomorrow. But Julian, just so you're prepared, this is going to cause a lot of damage. Family disputes over money rarely end well. It's already damaged, Julian said. I'm just making it official. They talked for a few more minutes about logistics. Ricardo said he'd send over the draft demand letter for Julian's approval. They hung up. Julian sat at his desk and looked at the Christmas tree in the living room, the lights still blinking, the presents still waiting. It occurred to him that he'd never opened those presents with Valeria, that by the time this was over, she might not speak to him for months, maybe years, maybe ever. But he didn't feel sad about it. He felt something else. Something like resolve. Something like self-respect. He thought about Caroline. What she would think of all this. Part of him thought she'd be disappointed. She'd always preached forgiveness, compassion, turning the other cheek. But another part of him, the part that remembered how fiercely she'd protected their family, thought maybe she'd understand. Maybe she'd see that what he was doing wasn't about revenge. It was about refusing to be invisible. He opened his laptop and started writing an email. To Valeria, to Matteo, to Arturo and Elena. He wanted them to hear it from him. He wanted them to know exactly what he'd done and why. The email took him 20 minutes to write. He revised it 3 times. When he was done, it was clear, direct, no emotion, just facts. Subject, change of plans. Valeria, Matteo, Arturo, and Elena. I woke up this morning to find you had left for the trip without me. I assume this was intentional, as all of your belongings were removed from my home and you departed before dawn without saying goodbye. I have cancelled all reservations and arrangements for the trip, including the resort accommodations, the private chef, the ski passes, the spa appointments, the wine tasting, and the car rental. You will find nothing waiting for you when you arrive. Additionally, I have instructed my attorney to draft a formal demand letter for repayment of the $63,000 in loans I have extended to Valeria and Matteo over the past 3 years. You will receive that letter within the next few days. I expect a response within 30 days. I will no longer be available to provide financial support or assistance. If you have questions, please direct them to my attorney, Ricardo Mendez, whose contact information is included below. Julian. He read it one more time. Then he hit send. He closed his laptop. He stood up. He walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. The house was still quiet. But it felt different now. It felt like his house. Not a place where people took advantage of him. Not a place where people expected things without earning them. Just his house. His phone buzzed. A text from Valeria. Can't wait to see the resort. We're about 2 hours out. So excited. Julian looked at the message. In 2 hours, they'd arrive at Mountain Peak Lodge. They'd walk into the lobby, give their name, and be told there was no reservation. They'd try to sort it out. Maybe they'd call him. Maybe they'd panic. Maybe they'd figure it out on their own. He didn't care which. He turned off his phone, and for the first time in years, Julian Herrera spent Christmas morning doing exactly what he wanted. He opened his own presents, he made himself breakfast, he put on music, he read a book. And he didn't think about them at all, but you tell me, was he right to cancel everything? Or did he go too far? Hold that thought, because in about 2 hours, Valeria's vacation was about to become a nightmare, and the fallout was going to be worse than anyone expected. The first call came at 10:47 a.m. Julian's phone, which he'd turned back on around 10 to check a message from his brother, lit up with Valeria's name. He didn't answer. It rang 6 times, then went to voicemail. 20 seconds later, she called again. He let it ring. Then again. And again. 4 calls in 3 minutes. Then a text. "Dad, call me. It's urgent." He didn't respond. He was sitting in his living room, reading a John le Carré novel he'd been meaning to get to for months. The winter light was coming through the windows. The house was warm. He was calm. Another text. "Dad, please, we need to talk to you. There's a problem with the resort." He set down his book and picked up his phone. He typed out a response. "I'm aware. I cancelled everything. Check your email." He went back to his book. His phone started ringing immediately. Valeria. He declined the call. It rang again. Matteo this time. Declined. Then Valeria again. He turned the ringer off and set the phone face down on the coffee table. For the next hour, his phone vibrated constantly. Calls, texts, voicemails piling up. He ignored all of it. He made himself lunch, turkey sandwich, kettle chips, a glass of iced tea. He ate slowly, savoring the quiet. At noon, he finally picked up his phone and scrolled through the messages. There were 17 texts from Valeria, 6 from Matteo, 3 from a number he didn't recognize but assumed was either Arturo or Elena, and 12 missed calls. The texts from Valeria started frantic. "Dad, what is going on? The resort says our reservation was cancelled. They're fully booked. We don't have anywhere to stay. Dad, please call me back. This isn't funny." Then they shifted to angry.
"I don't know what you're trying to prove, but this is ridiculous. We drove 6 hours. Matteo's parents are here. We have nowhere to go. You need to fix this." Then desperate. "Dad, please, I'm sorry if we upset you. Can we please just talk about this? We're standing in a lobby with all our bags and they're telling us to leave. Please." The texts from Matteo were shorter, more direct. "Julian,
This is incredibly immature. Call Valeria back and sort this out." One of the texts from the unknown number, which Julian now confirmed was Arturo, was polite but strained. "Julia, I'm not sure what happened here, but Elena and I are very confused. If there's been a misunderstanding, perhaps we can discuss it? We'd appreciate your help." Julian read through all of them. He felt nothing, no guilt, no second guessing, just a distant awareness that they were experiencing a fraction of the inconvenience and disappointment he'd felt that morning when he woke up alone. He put the phone down and went back to his book. At 1 p.m. the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. He walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. A delivery driver holding a small package. Julian opened the door, signed for the package, something he'd ordered for himself weeks ago, a replacement part for his espresso machine, and closed the door. As he walked back to the living room, his phone started ringing again. This time, it was a FaceTime call from Valeria. He considered declining it, but something made him answer. Maybe he wanted to see her face. Maybe he wanted her to see his. He swiped to accept. Valeria's face filled the screen. She was in a car, the back seat. Her eyes were red. She'd been crying. "Dad," she said, her voice shaking. "What the hell is going on?" Julian kept his voice even. "I sent you an email. Did you read it?" "Yes, I read it, and I don't understand. You cancelled everything? The resort, the chef, all of it? Why would you do that?" "You left without me," Julian said. "You packed your things and left my house at 5 in the morning on Christmas without saying goodbye. I woke up to an empty house and a note. So I decided if you didn't want me on the trip, you didn't need the trip. Valeria's face crumpled. Dad, it wasn't like that. We were just... Just what? Julian interrupted. Just trying to get a head start. Just trying to avoid the awkwardness of telling me to my face that I wasn't invited? You were invited. We assumed you'd drive up later. We thought you'd want to sleep in and come when you were ready. That's a lie, Valeria. Don't insult my intelligence. If you thought I'd drive up later, you would have said that. You would have left a note that said, "We're heading out early. See you at the resort." Yeah, but you didn't. You said, "We'll see you when you get there." As if my arrival was optional. As if you didn't care whether I came or not. That's not what I meant. It doesn't matter what you meant. It matters what you did. And what you did was exclude me from a trip I paid for. A trip I planned. A trip that was supposed to be about family. Valeria's face hardened. Okay, fine. Maybe we should have communicated better. But cancelling everything, leaving us stranded? That's cruel, Dad. Matteo's parents are here. They didn't do anything wrong. Matteo's parents are adults, Julian said. They can handle a change of plans. And you and Matteo have credit cards. You can book your own hotel. You can plan your own vacation. You don't need me. We can't afford this, Dad. You know we can't. We don't have $17,000 to spend on a week in Aspen. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you left me behind. Valeria stared at him through the screen. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. Are you serious right now? You're punishing us because your feelings got hurt. I'm not punishing you. I'm setting a boundary. I'm done being the person you use when it's convenient and ignore when it's not. We don't use you. Yes, you do. You call when you need money. You invite me to things when it benefits you. But when it comes to actually wanting me around, actually valuing my presence, you can't be bothered. You couldn't even spend Christmas morning with me, Valeria. Your mother's been gone for 3 years and you couldn't give me one morning. Valeria's eyes filled with tears. That's not fair. None of this is fair. But I'm done pretending it doesn't bother me. There was a long silence. Julian could hear voices in the background. Matteo asking what was happening. Arturo saying something Julian couldn't make out. Valeria wiped her eyes. What do you want from us, Dad? What do we have to do to fix this? I don't want anything from you, Julian said. I want you to take responsibility for your choices. I want you to acknowledge that what you did was hurtful. And I want you to stop expecting me to solve your problems. So what? We're supposed to just figure this out on our own? Drive back to Chicago? That's up to you. Dad, please, we're sorry, okay? We're sorry. Can we please just talk about this in person? Can you drive up here and we can work it out? No. Why not? Because I don't want to. Because I'm tired, Valeria. I'm tired of being the one who always compromises. I'm tired of being the one who always gives. I'm done. Valeria's face shifted. The tears stopped. Her expression hardened. Fine, if that's how you want it. But you should know that email you sent? About the loans? Matteo and I talked to a lawyer friend of ours on the drive. He said most of those loans are past the statute of limitations. You can't enforce them. Julian smiled. A small, cold smile. Then I guess you have nothing to worry about. You'll receive the formal demand letter in a few days. If you want to fight it,
Fight it. But I'm not backing down. This is insane. You're being insane. Maybe, or maybe I'm finally being sane. Valeria shook her head. I don't even know who you are right now. I'm the person you left behind, Julian said. Merry Christmas, Valeria. He ended the call. He set the phone down on the coffee table and sat back on the couch. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. He felt no regret, no doubt. Just a quiet certainty that he'd done the right thing. His phone buzzed. A text from Matteo.
You're a selfish, petty man. Valeria deserves better than this. Julian read it. He didn't respond. Another text, this time from the unknown number. Julian, this is Arturo. I don't know what's happening between you and your daughter, but Elena and I are caught in the middle. We'd appreciate it if you could at least help us find accommodations. We're elderly, and this is very stressful. Julian stared at that one for a long moment. He thought about Arturo and Elena. They were kind people. They'd always been polite to him, gracious. They probably had no idea that leaving him behind would result in this. But they'd gone along with it. They'd packed their bags and gotten in the car and driven away without questioning whether it was right to leave Julian out. They'd benefited from his generosity without advocating for his inclusion. He typed a response. Arturo, I'm sorry you're caught in the middle, but this is between me and my daughter. I'm sure Valeria and Matteo will figure something out. Best of luck. He sent it. He turned off his phone. The rest of the day passed quietly. Julian finished his book. He watched a movie. He made himself dinner. Steak, roasted vegetables, a glass of red wine. He ate at the dining table, the same table where they'd all sat the night before. And he didn't feel lonely. He felt free. That night, as he was getting ready for bed, he turned his phone back on to set his alarm. The messages had stopped. There was one final text from Valeria, sent 3 hours earlier. We found a motel outside of town. It's not great, but it'll do. I hope you're happy. Julian read it. He wasn't happy, but he wasn't unhappy either. He was something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He was at peace. He set his alarm. He turned off the light. He went to sleep. And when he woke up the next morning, the first thought that crossed his mind wasn't guilt or regret. It was clarity. He'd spent years trying to buy his daughter's love, trying to be indispensable, trying to make himself necessary. And all it had done was make him invisible, not anymore. But here's the thing, Julian's decision to cancel the trip and demand repayment wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a war. And over the next few weeks, as the reality of what he'd done sank in, the consequences would ripple through his family in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. Relationships would fracture, sides would be taken, and the question of who was right and who was wrong would get a lot more complicated. Because, as it turned out, there was more to this story than Julian knew. And when the full truth came out, it would change everything. The day after Christmas, Julian's phone stayed mostly quiet. A few texts from his brother asking how the trip went, which Julian answered vaguely. Fine, didn't work out as planned. His brother didn't press. A message from a colleague wishing him happy holidays. A notification from his credit card company about the refunds processing. Nothing from Valeria. Nothing from Matteo. Nothing from Arturo or Eleanor. Julian spent the day organizing his office. He'd been meaning to do it for months. Files sorted, old documents shredded, his desk cleared except for his laptop, a lamp, and a photo of Caroline from their 10th anniversary trip to Maine. She was standing on a rocky beach, smiling, her hair whipping in the wind. Julian looked at that photo for a long time. He wondered what she'd think of him now, what she'd say. He imagined her voice. Practical, kind, but firm. Julian, what are you doing? This isn't you, but it was him, or at least it was him now. The version of himself that had finally stopped apologizing for having boundaries. On December 27th, the demand letter arrived. Ricardo had emailed it to him the night before for approval, and Julian had signed off without changes. It was exactly what he'd asked for: professional, clinical, a clear breakdown of the 3 loans, the amounts owed, the original terms, and the request for repayment within 30 days. Ricardo had also included a copy of the signed promissory notes for the car loan and the business investment, along with email chains where the terms had been discussed. The graduate school loan was trickier. There was no formal note, just a series of text messages where Julian had said he'd help Valeria with her tuition and she'd said she'd pay him back when she could. But Ricardo had flagged those messages as evidence of intent. The letter was sent via certified mail to Valeria and Matteo's address. It would arrive in 2 days. Julian went about his life. He went to the gym. He met a friend for coffee. He started planning a trip for himself. Maybe Colorado, ironically. Maybe somewhere else. He didn't know yet. But the idea of planning something just for himself felt good. On December 29th, his phone rang. Valeria. He let it go to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She called again an hour later. Again, no message. Then a text. "Dad, we need to talk. Please call me." He didn't. That evening, a different number called, unknown. Julian almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Hello?" "Julian, it's Arturo." Julian paused. "Arturo, how are you?" "Not great, to be honest." "Julian, can we talk? Just you and me?" "About what?" "About what happened. About Valeria. About the trip. I think there are some things you should know." Julian sat down. "I'm listening." Arturo sighed. "First, I want to apologize. Elena and I didn't realize that leaving early was going to hurt you the way it did. We thought, well, Matteo told us that you'd prefer to drive up on your own time, that you liked having space in the mornings, and that this way you could arrive when you wanted. We didn't question it, we should have." "Matteo told you that?" "Yes, and we believed him. We've always believed him. He's our son." "But Julian, there's something else, something I think you need to know." "Go on." "The trip wasn't Valeria's idea, it was Matteo's. He's the one who brought it up. He told Valeria that it would be a good way to bring the families together, to spend time with Elena and me before we get too old to travel. Valeria loved the idea, but Matteo was the one who pushed for it. And when you offered to pay, Matteo was thrilled. He kept talking about how generous you were, how lucky Valeria was to have you." Julian felt something shift in his chest. And I don't think Matteo ever intended for you to come on the trip." Silence. "What do you mean?" Julian asked. "I mean, I think he wanted your money, but not your presence. I think he saw this as an opportunity to take a free vacation with his family and his wife, and you were just the means to make it happen." Julian's jaw tightened. "Did Valeria know?" "I don't know. I don't think so."
At least not at first. But Matteo has a way of convincing her of things. He's good at that. He's good at making people see things his way. Why are you telling me this? Because Elena and I have been watching this unfold, and we don't like what we're seeing. We don't like how Matteo talks about you. We don't like how he treats Valeria. And we don't like that we were used as part of this. Julian...
"Matteo is not a good man. I've known it for a while, but I've kept quiet because he's my son, and I want to believe the best of him. But what he did to you, what he's doing to Valeria, it's not right." Julian leaned back in his chair. "What do you want me to do with this information, Arturo?" "I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe I just wanted you to know that not everyone in this situation is against you, and that if you and Valeria have any chance of repairing your relationship, she needs to see Matteo for who he really is." "And who is he?" "A manipulator, a user, someone who sees people as resources, not as family." Julian closed his eyes. "Does Valeria know you're calling me?" "No, and I'd prefer it stayed that way. I'm calling because I think you deserve the truth, and because I'm worried about my daughter-in-law. She's not herself anymore, Julian. She's always stressed, always trying to keep Matteo happy always worried about money, even though Matteo spends like they have plenty. I think he's draining her, and I think he's trying to drain you too. Thank you for telling me, Julian said. I appreciate it. For what it's worth, I'm sorry for all of it. It's not your fault, Arturo. Maybe not, but I still wish I'd spoken up sooner. They said goodbye. Julian hung up and sat in the quiet of his study. Matteo. He'd always had a feeling about Matteo, small things. The way he'd let Valeria pay for dinners. The way he'd ask Julian for favors but never offer anything in return. The way he'd smile just a little too broadly when Julian wrote a check. But Julian had ignored it. Because Valeria loved him. Because Julian wanted to believe that his daughter had chosen well. Now, sitting with Arturo's words, Julian realized he'd been naive. He'd let Matteo into his life, into his family, into his finances, without asking the hard questions, without seeing the red flags. He thought about the loans, the $63,000. How much of that had been Matteo's idea? How much of it had been Matteo whispering in Valeria's ear, convincing her that asking her father for help was reasonable, normal, expected? Julian opened his laptop and pulled up his financial records. He started going through every transaction he'd made on Valeria and Matteo's behalf over the past 3 years. The wedding, the down payment on the house, the car, the business investment, the graduate school tuition, the furniture, the random emergencies that always seemed to come up right when Julian was feeling generous. He did the math. Over 3 years, he'd given them, not loaned, given over $140,000. $140,000. He sat back. He felt sick. Not because of the money. He had money. He could afford it. But because of what it represented. 3 years of being used. 3 years of being seen as an ATM. 3 years of his daughter prioritizing her husband's wants over her father's feelings. His phone buzzed. A text from Valeria. Dad, I got the letter from your lawyer. We need to talk about this. This is going to ruin us financially, please. Julian stared at the message. Part of him wanted to call her, to ask her outright. Did you know? Did you know Matteo was using me? Did you know he never wanted me on that trip? But another part of him already knew the answer. She had to have known. On some level, she had to have seen what Matteo was doing. And she'd let it happen. Because it was easier. Because it benefited her. Because challenging Matteo meant risking her marriage, and keeping her marriage intact was more important than protecting her father. He didn't respond to the text. That night, Julian couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Arturo's words. Matteo is not a good man. He kept thinking about the trip, the note, the empty house, the assumption that he'd just accept being left behind. And he kept thinking about Valeria, his daughter, the little girl who used to climb into his lap and ask him to read her stories, the teenager who'd cried on his shoulder when her first boyfriend broke her heart, the young woman who'd stood beside him at Caroline's funeral and held his hand through the whole service. When had she stopped being that person? Or had she always been capable of this, and he'd just refused to see it? At 2 a.m, Julian got out of bed and went to his study. He opened the filing cabinet and pulled out a box he kept in the back. Photos, old letters, mementos from Valeria's childhood, report cards, drawings. A Father's Day card she'd made when she was 8 that said, "You're the best dad in the world." He sat on the floor and went through the box. Every photo, every card, every piece of evidence that he'd been a good father, that he'd loved her, that he'd tried. And he realized something. He had been a good father. He'd done everything right. He'd been present, supportive, generous. He'd given her everything she needed and most of what she wanted. He'd taught her values. He'd modeled kindness. But somewhere along the way, she'd learned the wrong lesson. She'd learned that his love was transactional, that his presence was optional, that his worth was measured in dollars, not in moments. And maybe that was his fault too. Maybe by always saying yes, by always providing, by always making things easy, he'd taught her that she didn't need to value him. She just needed to ask. He put the photos back in the box. He put the box back in the cabinet. He went back to bed. And when he woke up the next morning, he knew what he had to do. He had to stand firm. He had to follow through on the demand letter. He had to let Valeria face the consequences of her choices. Not because he didn't love her, but because he did. And because loving someone sometimes means letting them fall. But even as he made that decision, a small voice in the back of his mind wondered, what if this is the thing that breaks us for good? What if she never forgives me? What if I lose her forever? He didn't have an answer. All he had was the certainty that he couldn't keep living the way he had been. He couldn't keep being invisible. He couldn't keep pretending that being needed was the same as being loved. So he chose himself. And he waited to see what would happen next. The formal response to the demand letter came on January 3rd. Not from Valeria or Matteo, but from their attorney, a lawyer named Patricia Dunn, based in Chicago, who specialized in family law and financial disputes. The letter was polite but firm. It acknowledged receipt of Julian's demand, outlined several legal arguments against enforceability, and requested a meeting to discuss a resolution. Julian forwarded the letter to Ricardo, who called him an hour later. They're taking this seriously, Ricardo said, which means they're worried. If they thought you didn't have a case, they'd tell you to pound sand. The fact that they want to meet means they think you might win. Do I have a case? Julian asked. For the car loan and the business investment, yes. You have signed promissory notes. Those are enforceable. The statute of limitations hasn't run out because the payments were supposed to be ongoing, which resets the clock. For the graduate school loan, it's murkier. No formal note means it comes down to intent, and intent can be argued either way. But even if we only pursue the two loans with notes, that's $47,000. Not nothing. What do they want to discuss? Probably a settlement. They'll offer to pay you back a portion of what you're owed in exchange for dropping the demand. Or they'll propose a payment plan. Something that doesn't destroy them financially, but also gets you something. I don't want a settlement. Ricardo paused. Julian, if you push this all the way, it's going to cost you legal fees, time, and the relationship with your daughter will be scorched earth. Are you sure that's what you want? I don't want a settlement, Julian repeated. I want accountability. Okay, then we proceed. I'll respond to their attorney and decline the meeting. We'll move forward with filing a lawsuit if they don't pay within the 30-day window. Do it. They hung up. Julian sat at his desk and looked out the window. It was snowing. Light, delicate flakes that melted as soon as they hit the ground. He thought about Valeria. About the last time they'd spoken on that FaceTime call where she'd cried and he'd stayed calm. He thought about the years of memories they'd built together, the good times, the laughter, the moments when she'd looked at him like he hung the moon. All of it felt very far away now. That afternoon, his phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. He answered. Julian, it's Patricia Dunn. I'm representing your daughter and son-in-law. I know who you are. I understand your attorney declined our request for a meeting. I'm calling to see if you'd reconsider. I think we can reach an agreement that's fair to everyone without this escalating further. What kind of agreement? Valeria and Matteo are willing to repay the car loan and the business investment over a 5-year period, monthly installments. They can't afford a lump sum, but they can manage payments. In exchange, you drop the demand for the graduate school loan and agree not to pursue any further financial claims. No. Mr. Herrera, I understand you're upset, but pursuing this legally is going to be expensive and painful for everyone involved. Valeria is your daughter. Surely there's a way to resolve this that doesn't destroy your relationship. My relationship with my daughter was destroyed the moment she left me behind on Christmas morning, Julian said. I'm not interested in half measures. They owe me $63,000. I want all of it. That's not realistic. Then we'll let a judge decide what's realistic. Patricia sighed. Mr. Herrera, I have to advise you that this could backfire. If the court rules in your favor and Valeria and Matteo can't pay, you could force them into bankruptcy. Is that really what you want? What I want is for them to take responsibility for their actions. They're trying to. They're offering to pay you back. Over 5 years, at no interest. That's not taking responsibility. That's kicking the can down the road. It's what they can afford. Then they shouldn't have borrowed money they couldn't repay. There was a long pause. I can see you're not going to budge on this. But I want you to know that Valeria is devastated. She's not sleeping. She's not eating. She feels like you've abandoned her. Julian laughed, a short, bitter sound. She feels like I abandoned her. That's rich. Mr. Herrera, we're done here, Ms. Dunn. If you have further questions, direct them to my attorney. He hung up. His hands were shaking. Not from anger, from something else. Something that felt like grief, because Patricia was right about one thing. This was destroying his relationship with Valeria, and it was destroying him too. Not because he regretted his decision, but because he was mourning what he'd lost. Not just his daughter, but the version of his daughter he'd believed in, the version who loved him for who he was, not for what he could give. That night, Julian had dinner with his brother Marcus. They met at a steakhouse in the Loop, a place they'd been going to for 20 years. Marcus was 2 years older, a corporate attorney, pragmatic and blunt. He'd heard bits and pieces of the story from Julian, but wanted the full version. Julian told him everything: the trip, the note, the cancellations, the demand letter, Arturo's call, the attorney's offer. When he finished, Marcus leaned back in his chair and took a sip of his scotch. So let me make sure I understand. You're suing your daughter for $63,000 because she hurt your feelings. That's reductive, but accurate. Julian bristled. She didn't just hurt my feelings, Marcus. She used me. She's been using me for years, and I'm done with it. Okay, fair. But Julian, you have to ask yourself, is this about the money, or is it about punishing her? It's about both. And which one matters more? Julian didn't answer right away. He looked at his brother. Marcus had always been the practical one, the one who saw the world in terms of costs and benefits, the one who made decisions with his head, not his heart. I don't know, Julian admitted. But I know I can't let this go. If I let this go, I'm telling her that it's okay to treat me this way, that I'll always be there to clean up her mess, that I don't deserve respect. You're not wrong, Marcus said, but you're also not thinking about the long-term consequences. Let's say you win. Let's say the court orders her to pay you back. You get your money, then what? You think she's going to call you on your birthday? You think she's going to invite you to Thanksgiving? You think your future grandkids are going to know who you are? Julian's chest tightened. I don't know. Because that's what you're trading, Julian. You're trading money for family, and I'm not saying you're wrong to do it. I'm just saying you need to be clear about what you're giving up. I didn't give it up. She did. Maybe, but you're the one making it permanent. They finished dinner in relative silence. Marcus paid the check, as he always did, and they walked out into the cold Chicago night. Before they parted ways, Marcus put a hand on Julian's shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I support you. But don't do this just to prove a point. Do it because it's what you actually want, because once you cross this line, there's no going back." Julian nodded. They hugged. Marcus got in his car and drove away. Julian stood on the sidewalk for a long time, watching the traffic, thinking about what his brother had said. Was this about the money, or was it about punishing Valeria? He didn't know. He didn't know if it mattered. What he did know was that for the first time in years, people were taking him seriously. Valeria was taking him seriously. Matteo was taking him seriously. They weren't dismissing him. They weren't ignoring him. They were afraid of him. And that felt like power. It felt like respect. Even if it wasn't love. He went home. He poured himself a glass of wine. He sat in his living room and looked at the Christmas tree, which he still hadn't taken down. The lights were off now. The presents were gone, donated to a charity. The room felt empty. His phone buzzed. A text from Valeria. "Dad, please, can we just talk? Just you and me. No lawyers, no Matteo, just us." Julian stared at the message. Part of him wanted to say yes. Part of him wanted to hear her voice, to hear her explain, to hear her apologize in a way that felt real. But another part of him knew that if he talked to her now, he'd fold, he'd forgive her, he'd let it go. And nothing would change, so he didn't respond. He turned off his phone, he finished his wine, he went to bed. And in the morning, he called Ricardo and told him to file the lawsuit. The lawsuit was filed on January 8th. Valeria and Matteo were served with the papers on January 10th. The case was straightforward. Breach of contract. Julian was suing for the full $63,000 plus interest and legal fees. The news spread quickly. Valeria told her friends. Matteo told his parents. Arturo called Julian, pleading with him to reconsider. Elena sent a text that simply said, "Please don't do this." Julian ignored all of it. The story made its way through Julian's social circle too. People had opinions. Some thought he was justified. Others thought he was cruel. A former colleague called and said, "I heard what happened. Good for you. People need to learn that generosity isn't weakness." A neighbor stopped him on the street and said, "I can't believe you're suing your own daughter. What would Caroline think?" Julian didn't engage. He went about his life. He worked on the house. He planned his solo trip to Colorado. He read. He exercised. He existed in a state of deliberate calm. But underneath the calm there was a crack. A small, growing crack that he couldn't quite ignore. It started with dreams. Dreams of Caroline. Dreams where she was sitting across from him at the kitchen table, looking at him with that expression she used to get when she was disappointed, but trying not to show it. In one dream, she said, "Julian, what are you doing?" He said, "I'm protecting myself." She said, "No, you're punishing her. There's a difference." He woke up from that dream at 3 a.m, sweating, his heart racing. He got out of bed and went to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water and sat at the table in the exact spot Caroline had been sitting in the dream. He thought about her, about what she would actually think of all this. Not the dream version, but the real Caroline. The woman who believed in second chances, who believed in forgiveness, who believed that family was worth fighting for, even when it was hard. But she'd also believed in accountability. She'd believed in teaching Valeria to be responsible. She'd believed that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. So which version of Caroline was right? The one who would tell him to forgive? Or the one who would tell him to stand firm? He didn't know, and because he didn't know, he stayed the course. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for late February. In the weeks leading up to it, Julian's life took on a strange rhythm. Days were normal: work, errands, the mundane tasks of existence. But nights were hard. Nights were when the doubt crept in, when he questioned whether he was doing the right thing, when he wondered if he was destroying the last connection he had to Caroline by destroying his relationship with their daughter. One night, he went into Caroline's office. He sat in her chair. He looked at her sketches on the wall. One of them was a logo she'd designed for a non-profit that helped low-income families. The tagline was, "Everyone deserves a second chance." Julian stared at that sketch for a long time. And then he did something he hadn't done in months. He cried. Not because he regretted the lawsuit, but because he missed his wife. He missed having someone who understood him, someone who could tell him when he was right and when he was wrong, someone who loved him unconditionally, not because of what he could provide, but because of who he was. He cried until there were no tears left. And then he went to bed. The next morning, his phone rang. It was Arturo. "Julian, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "Valeria and Matteo are talking about leaving Chicago, moving to Arizona near us. They're saying it's because of the lawsuit, because they can't afford to stay in the city anymore, because you've destroyed their financial stability." Julian felt a pang in his chest. And I don't think that's the real reason. I think Matteo wants to move because he's embarrassed, because people know about the lawsuit, because he doesn't want to face the judgment, but he's framing it like you're forcing them out, like you're the villain. "Let him," Julian said. "Julian, if they move, you'll lose her. You know that, right? You'll lose any chance of repairing this." "I lost her a long time ago, Arturo. I'm just accepting it now." Arturo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry for all of this. I wish I could have done more to prevent it." "It's not your fault." "Maybe not, but I still feel responsible. Matteo is my son, and I failed to raise him better than this." They talked for a few more minutes, then said goodbye. Julian hung up and sat with the news. Valeria might leave Chicago, might move 1,000 miles away, might disappear from his life entirely. And the worst part was he wasn't sure he cared, or maybe he cared too much and had learned to bury it so deep that it felt like not caring at all. Either way, the path was set. The lawsuit would proceed, the hearing would happen, and whatever came next, Julian would face it alone. But as he sat there in the house that felt emptier every day, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd won the battle but lost the war. He'd gotten his respect, he'd gotten his boundary, he'd gotten people to take him seriously, but he'd lost his daughter, and no amount of money could change that. The preliminary hearing took place on February 27th in a grey, fluorescent-lit courtroom on the 6th floor of the Daly Center. Julian arrived early with Ricardo. They sat at the plaintiff's table, reviewing notes, while the courtroom slowly filled. Valeria and Matteo arrived 10 minutes before the hearing was set to begin, accompanied by Patricia Dunn. Julian didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on the documents in front of him, but he could feel Valeria's presence, the weight of her gaze, the tension in the air between them. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judith Kowalski, called the court to order. She reviewed the case briefly: Julian Herrera, or Valeria, and Matteo Herrera, breach of contract, $63,000 in unpaid loans, and asked both sides to present their arguments. Ricardo went first. He laid out the facts cleanly: the promissory notes for the car loan and the business investment, the email and text evidence for the graduate school loan. the pattern of financial support provided with the expectation of repayment. He argued that the defendants had acted in bad faith by accepting the loans and then refusing to honor the terms once it became inconvenient. Patricia Dunn countered. She acknowledged the promissory notes, but argued that the loans had been made within a familial context, not a business one, which changed the expectations. She presented evidence of Julian's history of generosity, gifts, payments, support, and argued that the loans were part of that pattern, not separate from it. She claimed that Julian's demand for repayment was retaliatory, motivated not by financial need, but by personal grievance. Judge Kowalski listened to both sides, asked a few clarifying questions, and then paused. She looked at Julian, then at Valeria, then back at Julian. "Mr. Herrera," she said.
"Can I ask you something off the record?" Julian nodded. "What do you hope to achieve here? If you win this case, you'll get your money, but you'll lose your daughter. Is that a trade you're willing to make?" Julian took a breath. He looked at Valeria for the first time since entering the courtroom. She was crying. Silently, tears streaming down her face. Matteo had his arm around her,
But his expression was hard, defiant. Julian looked back at the judge. "Your Honor, I didn't lose my daughter in this courtroom. I lost her on Christmas morning when she decided that my presence in her life wasn't worth including. This lawsuit isn't about the money, it's about the principle that love and respect are not transactional, and that if someone chooses to treat you as a resource rather than a person, you have the right to stop providing that resource." Judge Kowalski studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Fair enough. She ruled in Julian's favor on the 2 loans with promissory notes, $47,000, plus interest, and dismissed the claim for the graduate school loan due to lack of formal documentation. She gave Valeria and Matteo 90 days to begin repayment or face further legal action. The hearing ended. Julian and Ricardo stood. Valeria and Matteo stood. They filed out of the courtroom in silence. In the hallway, Valeria stopped. She turned to Julian. Her face was blotchy from crying. Her voice was shaking. "Are you happy now?" Julian looked at her. His daughter, the person he'd loved more than anyone except Caroline. The person he'd built his whole life around after Caroline died. The person who'd left him behind without a second thought. "No," he said. "I'm not happy, but I'm at peace. You've destroyed us, Dad. You know that, right? We're going to have to sell the house. We're going to have to move. Our credit is ruined. And for what? So you could prove a point." "So I could prove that I matter," Julian said. "That I'm more than a checkbook. That I deserve to be treated with respect. I always respected you. No, you didn't. You took me for granted. And when I stopped letting you, you called it cruelty." Valeria shook her head. "I don't even know you anymore." "Good," Julian said. "Because the person you knew was a doormat. And I'm done being that person." He walked away. Ricardo followed. They left Valeria and Matteo standing in the hallway, and Julian didn't look back. Outside, the sky was overcast, the kind of grey that makes everything feel muted. Julian and Ricardo stood on the courthouse steps. "You okay?" Ricardo asked. "Yeah," Julian said. "I think I am. She might not pay, you know. She might file for bankruptcy, drag this out." "I know. And if she does, you'll have spent all this time and money and gotten nothing." "I'll have gotten something," Julian said. "I'll have gotten my dignity back." Ricardo nodded. They shook hands. Julian walked to his car, got in, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about Valeria's face in the courtroom, the tears, the pain. He wondered if she was hurting because she was genuinely sorry or because she was facing consequences for the first time in her life. He didn't know. And he realized he didn't need to know. Because this wasn't about her anymore. It was about him, about reclaiming the parts of himself he'd given away trying to buy love. He started the car and drove home. That night he opened a bottle of wine. He sat on his back porch, even though it was cold, and looked at the stars. He thought about Caroline, about the life they'd built, about the daughter they'd raised. And he thought about what came next. Because the lawsuit was over, but the story wasn't. Valeria had 90 days to start repayment, 90 days to decide whether she'd honor the court's ruling or fight it further. 90 days for Julian to wait and see if she'd choose accountability or avoidance. But whatever she chose, Julian knew one thing for certain. He'd done the right thing. Not the easy thing, not the kind thing maybe, but the right thing. The thing that said, I am worth more than this. I deserve better than this. And if Valeria couldn't see that, then maybe it was time to let her go. 2 months after the hearing, Julian received a check in the mail, $47,000 from Valeria and Matteo. No note, no explanation, just the check. He deposited it, he paid Ricardo's legal fees. He put the rest in a savings account and didn't think about it. A week later, he got a text from Arturo. Valeria and Matteo are moving to Phoenix. They leave next month. I thought you should know. Julian read the text. He didn't respond. He spent the next few weeks finalizing his own plans. The solo trip to Colorado, a photography class he'd been meaning to take, volunteering at a local non-profit, the same one Caroline had designed that logo for. He built a new life, one that didn't revolve around being needed, one that revolved around being whole. And one day, months later, he realized he hadn't thought about Valeria in over a week, hadn't wondered if she was okay, hadn't felt the ache of missing her. He didn't know if that was healing or just numbness, but it felt like progress. And that was enough. So that's the story. Every detail, every complication, every painful, messy moment. Julian Herrera, a man who loved his daughter more than anything, who gave her everything, who woke up on Christmas morning to find himself alone and excluded from a trip he'd paid for. A man who made the controversial, divisive decision to cancel that trip and demand repayment of years of loans. A man who chose his dignity over his daughter's comfort. Now it's your turn to decide. Was Julian right to do what he did? Was he justified in cancelling the trip and pursuing legal action? Or did he take it too far? Was he punishing Valeria for a mistake, or was he setting a necessary boundary? And what about Valeria? Was she a user, someone who took advantage of her father's generosity? Or was she a daughter caught between her husband's manipulation and her father's expectations? Did she deserve what happened to her? Or was Julian's response disproportionate? You've heard everything, no detail left out. So you tell me, who was in the wrong? Was anyone fully right? Or is it more complicated than that? Before you cast your verdict, let's break down the psychology behind what we just witnessed, because understanding how this happened might change how you see who's responsible. You've heard the story, you feel the anger, the confusion, maybe even the sadness, but do you know exactly what happened to your brain just now? Do you understand the specific psychological machinery that turned a family vacation into a courtroom battle? This isn't just a story about hurt feelings or financial disputes. This is a case study in emotional manipulation, transactional relationships, and the invisible contract that forms when love becomes conditional. And if you've ever felt used by someone you love, if you've ever questioned whether you're being taken advantage of, or if you're just being paranoid, pay very close attention. Because we're about to expose the exact mechanism that trapped Julian for years. The weapon used against Julian has a name. It's called covert instrumentalization. That's not a term you'll find in a psychology textbook because it's usually described in pieces: financial abuse, emotional exploitation, transactional relationships. But when you combine all those elements, you get something specific, a pattern where someone treats you as a resource while maintaining the appearance of a genuine relationship. Here's how it works mechanically. Step 1. Establish dependency. The person using you identifies what you can provide: money, emotional support, social status, whatever, and positions themselves in a way that makes providing that resource feel natural. In Julian's case, Valeria and Matteo didn't explicitly demand money. They created situations where Julian offering money felt like the loving, fatherly thing to do. Car breaks down, Dad helps. Business opportunity, Dad invests. It's framed as family support, not financial exploitation. Step 2. Normalize the pattern. Once you've provided the resource a few times, it stops being a favor and starts being an expectation. Julian helped with the wedding, so helping with the house down payment made sense. Helped with the house, so helping with the car was natural. Each act of generosity set the precedent for the next, until Julian's role in the family became the person who solves problems with money. And because it happened gradually, he didn't notice the shift from Dad, who helps sometimes, to Dad, who always pays. Step 3. Remove reciprocity. This is the key. In a healthy relationship, there's balance. If I help you move, you help me paint my deck. If you loan me money, I pay you back, or at minimum express deep, genuine gratitude and make an effort to return the favor in some way. But in covert instrumentalization, reciprocity disappears. The person using you treats your generosity as a given, something they're entitled to, not something they need to earn or repay. Julian gave and gave, but Valeria and Matteo's gratitude became perfunctory, their effort to include him in their lives minimal. Remember when Julian said in the story that Valeria started calling less, that Sunday brunches went from weekly to monthly to barely at all? That wasn't coincidence. That was the instrumentalizer's playbook. Once you've secured the resource, you reduce the relationship maintenance because you don't actually value the person. You value what they provide. And as long as they keep providing, the relationship persists. But the moment they stop, the moment Julian cancelled the trip, the mask comes off. Let's go back to the beginning of the story. Point 2. The moment Julian started planning this trip. Remember how it was framed. Valeria called and asked if he'd be willing to do something for them. A big family trip. Somewhere nice. She didn't explicitly ask him to pay, but the implication was clear. That right there, that's the test. She was testing whether Julian's role was still provider. And when he said yes immediately, enthusiastically, she knew the dynamic hadn't changed. She knew she could ask for more. Now think about Christmas Eve. Julian hosted dinner. He cooked. He set the table with Caroline's china. He made a big deal out of it because he wanted everyone to feel special. And how did they respond? They smiled. They said thank you. But look at what happened next. They left at 5 in the morning without him. They took the trip he'd planned and paid for and excluded him from it. That wasn't an accident. That was a statement. It said, we value what you provide, but we don't actually want you around. And Julian, to his credit, recognized it. That note on the counter wasn't a miscommunication. It was the instrumentalization made explicit. So why does a human being do this? Why would Valeria, who presumably loved her father at some point, treat him this way? There are a few possibilities. One is that Matteo, the husband, was the primary driver. Arturo's phone call suggested as much, that Matteo saw Julian as a resource, not family, and that he'd slowly influenced Valeria to see her father the same way. That's a common dynamic when someone marries into a family with wealth. The new spouse sees an opportunity and begins subtly reframing the relationship from emotional to transactional. But here's the hard truth. Even if Matteo was the instigator, Valeria allowed it. She went along with it. She benefited from it. And at a certain point, her complicity became indistinguishable from active participation. That's the trap of covert instrumentalization. It lets the user maintain plausible deniability. Valeria could tell herself she wasn't using her father because she never explicitly demanded money. She just accepted it when offered. She never said, "I don't want you on the trip," said he. She just left without waking him. This brings us to the second concept, the impact. The reason Julian couldn't just walk away earlier, the reason he kept giving, kept hoping, kept believing that if he just did one more thing, Valeria would finally see his value. That's a psychological phenomenon called intermittent reinforcement. Here's how it works biologically. When you give someone something and they respond with affection, your brain releases dopamine. That's the reward chemical. It feels good. It reinforces the behavior. But here's the trick. Intermittent reinforcement, where the reward comes unpredictably, sometimes there and sometimes not, is actually more powerful than consistent reinforcement. It's the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. You don't win every time you pull the slot machine lever, but you win often enough that your brain keeps chasing that dopamine hit. Julian's relationship with Valeria operated on intermittent reinforcement. Sometimes when he gave her money or planned something special, she responded with genuine warmth. She'd call him the best dad, she'd hug him, she'd make him feel valued, but other times she barely acknowledged it. Sunday brunches got cancelled, phone calls went unreturned, the warmth was inconsistent, and that inconsistency kept Julian hooked because his brain was constantly chasing the next moment when Valeria would make him feel loved. Now let's talk about the specific decision that everyone criticized Julian for, the choice to stay and fight back instead of quietly walking away. That's where the audience probably splits. Some of you think he was justified, others think he was petty. So let's break down exactly why his brain forced him to do it. This is a concept called reactive boundaries. When someone violates your trust or takes advantage of you, your nervous system goes into threat mode. Your amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for detecting danger, starts firing. And your prefrontal cortex, the rational part, goes offline. In that state, you're not thinking about long-term consequences or relationship repair. You're thinking about immediate protection. You're thinking, how do I make this stop? How do I prove that I matter? Julian's decision to cancel the trip wasn't calculated, it was reactive. He woke up, saw the note, felt the betrayal, and his brain said, fight back. Protect yourself. Show them you're not powerless, and so he did. He called the resort. He cancelled everything. He sent the email. All of it in the span of a few hours, driven by adrenaline and hurt. But here's the thing. Reactive boundaries, while emotionally satisfying in the moment, often create more problems than they solve, because they're not about setting healthy limits. They're about punishment. They're about making the other person feel the pain you're feeling. And that's why the lawsuit happened. Julian didn't need the $63,000. He's wealthy. He could afford to lose it. But he needed Valeria to understand what she'd done. He needed her to face consequences, and the lawsuit was the mechanism for that. Now here's where it gets psychologically messy. Was Julian wrong to pursue the lawsuit? From a purely rational standpoint, maybe. It cost him money, time, and his relationship with his daughter. But from an emotional standpoint, it was the only way he could reclaim his sense of self-worth. For years, he'd defined himself by his ability to provide. When Valeria rejected his presence but accepted his money, it shattered his identity. The lawsuit was his way of saying, if I'm only valuable for my money, then you don't get the money anymore either. You don't get to have it both ways. That's the synthesis. When you combine covert instrumentalization, a relationship where you're valued only for what you provide, with intermittent reinforcement, a pattern that keeps you hooked despite inconsistent affection, you don't get a relationship. You get a hostage situation. And Julian was the hostage. The trip cancellation and the lawsuit were his escape plan. So here's the question. Was he right to escape that way? Or should he have found a healthier exit? Most people would say there's a middle ground. He could have set boundaries without destroying the relationship. He could have had a conversation with Valeria about how her behavior hurt him. He could have cut off financial support without pursuing legal action. But here's what most people miss. Julian tried the middle ground for years. He hinted, he pulled back. He waited for Valeria to notice, and she didn't. Or if she did, she didn't care enough to change. So when the trip happened, when the final, undeniable evidence of instrumentalization appeared, Julian's brain said, enough, no more middle ground, no more hoping she'll change. It's time to burn the bridge. And maybe that was necessary. Maybe some relationships can't be saved. Maybe the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to walk away, even if it's painful, even if it means losing someone you love. But let's be honest, Julian didn't walk away. He blew it up. And there's a difference. Now let's talk about the evidence, the red flags that were there all along that Julian missed or ignored, that might have prevented this entire situation if he'd recognized them earlier. Because if you see these 5 signs in your own life, the ending is almost mathematically guaranteed. Red flag number 1, love bombing followed by withdrawal. At the beginning of the story, when Valeria met Matteo, everything seemed fine. Valeria was attentive. She called Julian regularly. She included him in her life. But after the wedding, after Julian had paid $42,000 for it, the attention dropped off. Calls became less frequent. Visits became less enthusiastic. That shift from intense affection to gradual distancing is a classic pattern in exploitative relationships. The affection was never about Julian. It was about securing his investment. Once the investment was made, the affection was no longer necessary. Here's the test. In a healthy relationship, affection is consistent. It doesn't spike when someone needs something and disappear when they don't. If you notice that pattern, if someone is warm and loving when they want a favor and cold and distant once they've gotten it, you're not dealing with love. You're dealing with strategy. At the beginning of the story, when Valeria started planning the trip, she was attentive again. She called more. She was sweet. She told Julian he was the best dad. And then, once he'd committed to paying, once the trip was booked, she distanced again. That wasn't coincidence. That was the pattern. Red flag number 2, eroded boundaries. Julian had a boundary early on. He wanted to be valued for more than his money, but over time that boundary got eroded. Car loan, business investment, graduate school tuition. Each time he said yes, the boundary moved. Each time Valeria asked for something and he provided it without question, he taught her that his boundary was negotiable. Here's the critical moment. Remember when Valeria called to ask about the trip? She didn't explicitly ask Julian to pay. She just implied it. And Julian, because the boundary was already eroded, didn't even consider saying no. He didn't think, wait, should I be paying for this? He just jumped in and offered. That's how boundary erosion works. It's gradual. It's subtle. You don't notice it happening until you look back and realize you've been giving and giving and giving, and the other person has been taking and taking and taking, and somehow it became normal. The counter move. When someone implies a request, instead of making it explicit, stop and ask yourself, Why are they being vague? Are they testing whether I'll offer? Are they trying to avoid the discomfort of asking directly? And if the answer is yes, that's your cue to hold the line, to say, if you need something from me, ask me directly, don't hint. Red flag number 3. Isolation disguised as independence. Valeria's gradual distancing wasn't just about reducing contact with Julian, it was about isolating him from her life. She stopped inviting him to things, she stopped including him in decisions. She built a life with Matteo that didn't have room for Julian unless Julian was providing something, and she framed it as healthy, as independence, as her building her own family. But independence doesn't mean exclusion. Independence means making your own choices while still valuing the people who matter to you. Valeria wasn't being independent. She was being distant, and she used the language of independence to make Julian feel guilty for wanting more. This is a common tactic in exploitative relationships. The person using you will frame your reasonable need for connection as clinginess or neediness. They'll make you feel like you're asking for too much when all you're asking for is basic respect and inclusion. If someone in your life is telling you that wanting to be included is unreasonable, that wanting reciprocity is demanding, that wanting to be valued is needy, run. Because that's not a relationship. That's a trap. Red flag number 4. Financial enmeshment without gratitude. Julian gave Valeria and Matteo over $140,000 in 3 years. That's not a small amount. That's life-changing money. And yet by the end, their gratitude was perfunctory. Thank you became automatic, meaningless. They expected his help. They took it for granted. Here's the thing about gratitude. It's not just about saying thank you. It's about recognizing the sacrifice someone made for you and honoring it. When Julian paid for the wedding, Valeria should have recognized that as a massive gift, one that came from his hard-earned money and his love for her. She should have treated that gift as sacred. But instead, she moved on to the next ask, and the next, and the next. If someone in your life takes your generosity for granted, if they stop expressing genuine appreciation, if they start treating your help as an entitlement, that's the moment to stop helping, because you're not building a relationship, you're building resentment. Red flag number 5, the loyalty test. Christmas morning, the note, the early departure. That was Valeria's loyalty test, and Julian failed it, at least from her perspective, because the test wasn't about whether Julian would be hurt. It was about whether Julian would accept being excluded without making a fuss. Exploitative people use loyalty tests all the time. They do something hurtful and then see how you react. If you accept it quietly, they know they can do it again. If you push back, they frame you as the problem. Either way, they win. Julian's mistake was that he didn't recognize the test for what it was. He thought it was a mistake, a miscommunication, but it wasn't. It was deliberate. It was Valeria and Matteo seeing if they could exclude Julian from the trip he paid for and get away with it. And if Julian had let it slide, if he'd driven up to Aspen later that day and pretended everything was fine, they would have learned that they could treat him however they wanted without consequences. So let's bring it all together. You have the facts, the story, the trip, the cancellation, the lawsuit. You have the motive. Julian's years of being used, of being valued only for his money, of being excluded from the life he was funding. You have the evidence, the red flags that were there from the beginning, the love bombing, the eroded boundaries, the isolation, the lack of gratitude, the loyalty test. Now you must decide, is this a tragedy of errors or a calculated manipulation? Was Julian right to cancel the trip and pursue legal action? Or was he overreacting to a thoughtless mistake? Was Valeria a victim of her husband's influence, or was she complicit in using her father? Did she deserve what happened, or was Julian's response disproportionate? And what about Matteo? Was he the villain the manipulator who orchestrated the whole thing? Or was he just a guy trying to build a life with his wife, caught in the crossfire of a father-daughter conflict? I'm handing the gavel to you. The court is adjourned. See you in the comments.